Imagine you find yourself in the following situation. You've just finished a great television show, and you're looking for another great television show to start, but you're not sure which of all the great television shows that are on TV right now you should start watching. You might go ask a friend. So you ask your friend, which shows should I be into right now? Your friend might reasonably ask, well, which shows have you liked in the past? You might respond, I think Breaking Bad is the greatest show that's ever been on television. And then your friend might say, there was another show, Weeds, which had a protagonist who ended up selling drugs for a living. So you'll end up liking Weeds just exactly as much as you liked Breaking Bad. Should you trust your friend's argument? I'm Brian Russell from Bakersfield College, and today we're talking about arguments by analogy. All arguments by analogy are based on a comparison between two different entities or two different groups of entities in the form of an analogical argument. You see that these are captured by entity A and entity B. And the way the argument plays out, it says entity A and entity B share many features. A, B, there could be C, D, E, F, however many features you can pin that they share. And entity A has a further feature, Z. So the argument goes, entity A and entity B both have A, B, C, D, E, etc. A also has this further feature, Z, so the argument concludes, therefore B will have the further attribute Z. In the example I opened with, the argument would go, Breaking Bad has the attribute of having a protagonist who ends up selling drugs for a living, and you love that show, so your friend reasoned Weeds has the attribute of having a protagonist who sells drugs for a living, therefore you'll probably love that show too. Let's fill this argument in with another example. Imagine Lucy's thinking about buying a car, and she wants a car with good gas mileage. So she looks at her friend Tom's car. Tom's car is a Chevrolet, and it gets good gas mileage. So she reasons, well, I'm considering a Chevrolet, therefore the car I'm considering will also get good gas mileage. She's building an argument based on a comparison between her car and Tom's car and the feature that they're both Chevrolets. And since his car is a Chevrolet and gets good gas mileage, therefore she reasons that hers will also get good gas mileage. So all arguments by analogy can be put in roughly this form. All arguments from analogy have parts, and we should talk about those parts. So, entity A and entity B in the standard form of an argument by analogy are called analogs. The entity A is the primary analog, and entity B is the secondary analog. So the secondary analog is what the conclusion is being drawn about. Entity A is the point of comparison, the primary point of comparison, the primary analog. They share similarities, so the attributes A and B, or in the example argument, the Chevrolet, those are the similarities. And then attribute Z is what's called the conclusory feature. So entity A and entity B, the analogs, share attributes A and B. They share these similarities, so we reason that because entity A has this conclusory feature Z, that entity B will have it as well. Or in our original argument, or in our example argument, we would say Tom's car is the primary analog, Lucy's car is the secondary analog. Them being Chevrolets are the similarities, and the conclusory feature is gets good gas mileage. So now that we know the form of arguments by analogy. We've looked at a couple of examples, and now that we know how to identify the parts, the next thing we need to do is talk about how we evaluate arguments by analogy. There are 6 different things that we should consider when we're thinking about how strong an argument by analogy is. The first thing that we should consider is the relevance of similarities. All arguments from analogy are based on a comparison. They're based on similar features that 2 different entities have. So how relevant is the similarities that we've called out to the conclusory feature? In this case, how relevant is it that Tom's car is a Chevrolet to the conclusory feature that it gets good gas mileage? Well, Chevrolet has many models. So some get good gas mileage. The Chevy Volt is an entirely electric car. It gets great gas mileage. But it also has Chevrolet has a Corvette. It has trucks. These don't get such great gas mileage. So how relevant is being a Chevrolet to getting good gas mileage? Well, not super relevant. There isn't a very tight relationship between things being a Chevrolet and things getting good gas mileage. So in this case, we might wonder about the argument on those grounds. What are the number of similarities? This is our second feature of an analogical argument that we should pay attention to when evaluating it. In this case, there's only one similarity that's called out. So Tom's car is a Chevrolet and gets good gas mileage, so it's a Chevrolet. That's the only similarity that we've called out between Tom's car and Lucy's car. Imagine further that Tom's car is a Chevrolet hybrid and gets good gas mileage. Lucy's car is a Chevrolet hybrid. So because now we've added an additional similarity, especially a relevant similarity, now the argument's getting stronger. If we reduce those similarities, then the argument gets weaker. Another thing to look for is the nature and degree of disanalogy. So how analogous are the 2 entities that we're comparing? Are there any relevant dissimilarities? So is Tom's car a hybrid but Lucy's car is a truck? If so, then even though they share the similarity of being a Chevrolet, there's a huge disanalogy between them in that one's a hybrid and one's a truck. So that would be a serious disanalogy. Now, a disanalogy can make an argument weaker, like in the example I just gave, but a disanalogy could also make the conclusion more likely to be true. So we would say it would make the argument actually stronger. So imagine Tom's car is a Chevrolet, but it's a Corvette, and for some reason it gets good gas mileage. Lucy's car is a Chevrolet. The car that Lucy's considering is also a Chevrolet, but it's a hybrid. Well, now that disanalogy actually makes the conclusion that the car Lucy's considering will get good gas mileage even more likely to be the case. So note, the nature and degree of disanalogy can go both ways. A disanalogy could make the argument weaker, make the conclusion less likely to be true, or it could make the argument stronger, making the conclusion more likely to be true. The number of primary analogs is also something we should pay attention to. In the example argument here, only one primary analog is mentioned, Tom's car. Imagine further that Lucy knew more people who had Chevrolets and that also got good gas mileage. So it wasn't just Tom's car, which was a Chevrolet and got good gas mileage, but also Bob, Sally, and Harry. They all had Chevrolets and they all got good gas mileage. Increasing the number of primary analogs will have the effect of strengthening the analogical argument. Decreasing the number of primary analogs would have the effect of weakening the analogical argument. Diversity among primary analogs is also something we need to pay attention to. So imagine we had a number of primary analogs: Tom's car, Sally's car, Harry's car. They were all Chevrolets that got good gas mileage. But imagine that they were all the exact same hybrid model. Well, then we wouldn't have much diversity among the primary analogs, so it would make our conclusion a little weaker. Imagine instead that Tom, Sally, and Harry's car, they were all Chevrolets, and they were all different models. And they all got good gas mileage. Well, that would make it more likely that whatever Chevrolet Lucy was considering, that it would also get good gas mileage. Finally, something we would want to pay attention to is the specificity of the conclusion. So in this case, Lucy's conclusion is that the car that she's considering will also get good gas mileage. Now that seems like a pretty easy mark to hit. What qualifies as good gas mileage? Probably something about, it depends on what type of model you're looking at, but something over 25 miles per gallon would seem pretty good, right? So anything above that would maybe qualify as good gas mileage. If Lucy's conclusion was more specific, that she will get 50 miles per gallon, then it would make the argument actually weaker. She would be trying to hit a more specific target, a smaller target. So she would need better reasons to get there. If, on the other hand, her conclusion was not as specific, was more general, that the car Lucy's considering will get at least a couple miles per gallon, then her argument actually gets stronger because the target that it's trying to hit is easier. So the specificity of conclusion works in this way. The more specific the conclusion, the harder it is to hit, the weaker the argument becomes if everything else in the premises remains the same. If the conclusion gets less specific, then if everything else in the argument stays the same, the argument actually gets stronger. So that's how the specificity of conclusion factors into our evaluation. Now let's look at how we might use the information that we just covered in the slides to do some work on analogical arguments. Because when we find analogical arguments in the wild, we don't find them neatly placed into premises and conclusion. Usually we find them in prose. So how do we go from the prose to an argument by analogy with a form that is easy to recognize the parts from and is easy to evaluate? And then if we switch some features around in the argument, what effect might that have on the argument itself? So consider the following argument. Rebecca is anticipating the purchase of a new TV set, and she notices that her friend Anastasia's new Sony gets the finest picture she has ever seen. Rebecca concludes that if she buys a Sony, her set will get approximately the same picture as Anastasia's. So before we get to evaluating the argument and figuring out how shifting different features in the argument around might affect our evaluation, let's put this argument in standard form. So where did we find these pieces in the passage? Anastasia's TV is here, and it's a Sony. That's the similarity. And then the conclusory feature has great picture quality. It says gets the finest picture she's ever seen. We could put that in there if we wanted to, but great picture quality covers it. Therefore, the TV set, what's the conclusion? The TV set Rebecca is considering will get approximately the same picture quality as Anastasia's. So, imagine we were asked to identify the primary analog, secondary analog, similarities, and conclusory feature. What's the primary analog? We can find it right at the beginning of the first premise, and that's Anastasia's TV set. The secondary feature, the thing the conclusion is being drawn about, the TV set Rebecca is considering. What are the similarities? They're both Sonys. But being a Sony, they both have the attribute of being a Sony. And what's the conclusory feature? Having great picture quality. All right, so here's what we would do if we were asked to put the argument in the paragraph in standard analogical argument form. We did that up here. And then if we were asked to identify the primary analog, secondary analog, similarities, and conclusory feature, this is how we would do that. Now, let's go a little further. How do the following facts bear on Rebecca's argument? Would they make her argument stronger, weaker, or have no effect? How would they have the effect that they do? In other words, which of the six things we need to consider when evaluating an analogical argument would these changes be using? That's a complex way of saying a really simple thing. Let's see how we can do it. The model Rebecca is planning to buy has the same color of cabinet, the same size speakers, the same remote control, and the same stand as Anastasia's argument, as Anastasia's model. What Rebecca is worried about and what the conclusion is about is picture quality. So what effect will this have on her argument? No effect at all. Now, what if we learn that the model Rebecca is planning to buy has the same picture tube and the same electronic circuitry as Anastasia's? Well, those additional features are very relevant to picture quality. So this would seem to make the argument stronger. And how would it be making the argument stronger? It would make the argument stronger by doing what? Well, it's saying the model she's planning to buy has additional similarities to Anastasia's TV set. The additional similarities would be the same picture tube and the same electronic circuitry. So this would make the argument stronger by adding similarities, adding additional similarities. So we have even more reason to believe that Rebecca's TV set will get approximately the same picture quality as Anastasia's. Now, what if instead we learned Rebecca plans to use the rabbit ear antenna that comes with the set? She lives in a 4th floor apartment in Manhattan, while Anastasia lives in a 70th floor penthouse. Well, Manhattan has a lot of tall buildings around it. If she's using a rabbit ear antenna, will she get approximately the same picture quality? Unlikely. There will probably be plenty of interference. Oh, this example was from back when TV sets were using these rabbit ear antennas. But what effect would this have? This would have the effect of weakening the argument. It would be unlikely that Rebecca would get picture quality similar to Anastasia's if she was living on the 4th floor while Anastasia was living on the 70th floor, and imagine they were both using these rabbit ears. So it would weaken the argument. How would it do that? It would provide a disanalogy. a disanalogy or a dissimilarity, it would weaken the argument in that way. The two things being compared are similar in that they're both Sonys, but it's a different situation because one's being used on the 4th floor, one's being used on the 70th floor, and that matters when you're using those rabbit ear antennas. So that would weaken the argument. Let's say instead we learned Anastasia's transmission is supplied by a cable company. Well, that again would seem to weaken the argument. How? By providing a disanalogy. Rebecca changes her mind and decides to hook up with the same cable company as Anastasia. Well, now, instead of weaken the argument by providing a disanalogy, now this is providing an additional similarity. So it would strengthen the argument by providing an additional similarity. Imagine we also learned that Rebecca knows of 5 other people who own the same Sony model as Anastasia and who get approximately the same picture quality. So instead of just knowing Anastasia owns a TV set that's a Sony and has great picture quality, now she knows 5 other people in addition to Anastasia. That would seem to strengthen her argument. And why would it strengthen it? What's it doing? Well, Anastasia here is a primary analog. It's adding additional primary analogs. And because all of these people get great picture quality, now it's even more likely that Rebecca will also get great picture quality. So, strengthens the argument. And why? It strengthens it by adding additional primary analogs. These 5 people live in the same apartment building. The same apartment building that Anastasia lives in. They likely have the same cable company. This is weakening the argument. It's weakening the argument because now there isn't great diversity amongst the primary analogs. We would hope that people with Sony TVs, regardless of where they lived, say there were 6 different examples in 6 different places that had Sonys with great picture quality, that would strengthen the argument. But now that we know this actually weakens the argument by showing that the primary analogs are not diverse. Imagine that Rebecca discovers 4 additional people who live in various parts of Manhattan and who all own the same model Sony and get approximately the same picture quality as Anastasia. This would strengthen the argument quite a bit. And the reason it would strengthen the argument quite a bit is that it adds primary analogs and demonstrates or shows the primary analogs are diverse. So it added additional primary analogs, and because they were in different circumstances, showed that the primary analogs are diverse. It's even more likely to be the case that Rebecca will have great picture quality now. Rebecca changes her conclusion to state that she will get at least as good a picture as Anastasia instead of approximately as good. At least as good is saying that much or better. Instead of approximately, could be anywhere around. This probably weakens the argument. And why does it weaken the argument? By increasing the specificity of the conclusion. And say instead she changed her conclusion to state that she will get exactly the same picture as Anastasia. Exactly the same is an even smaller target to hit. This also would weaken the argument by increasing the specificity. So if you clean up all the questions from your homework, then this is what it should look like in the end. And what should we say about our original argument about whether or not you should try watching Weeds? Well, if we evaluate it in terms of the 6 features of evaluating an analogical argument that we discussed, the relevance of the similarities. The similarity was that there's a protagonist who starts dealing drugs for a living. Is that relevant to a show being great? Not as relevant as things like great acting or great writing. How many similarities were there? Well, there was only one called out in the initial argument, and that is that there was that character who started dealing drugs. So we would want more similarities between the shows. One might not be enough to draw that conclusion. Are there dissimilarities between the shows? Certainly. Breaking Bad was much more of a drama than Weeds, whereas Weeds was primarily a comedy. So there are plenty of dissimilarities between the 2 shows. How many primary analogs were there in the initial argument? Just one. It was just Breaking Bad. So that would lead us to believe that the argument is not especially strong. Diversity among the primary analogs, well, recall that there was only one. So not very diverse. And since Breaking Bad was a fairly unique show in many ways, that would lead us to believe that the argument is not especially strong. Finally, recall that the specificity of the conclusion was very high. Your friend told you that you'd like Weeds exactly as much as Breaking Bad. That's a very specific conclusion, meaning that the argument itself would have to be very strong to support it. The argument itself was not especially strong. So, maybe you should check out Weeds, maybe you shouldn't in that circumstance. Hope you've learned a lot about arguments by analogy. We covered what an argument from analogy basically is, the form of our analogical argument. We covered a few examples. We talked about the parts of arguments by analogy. And finally, we talked about the 6 things you want to keep in mind when evaluating how strong an argument by analogy is.